Before Nepal became the nation. Omar Farooq Duman. Before Nepal became the nation we recognize today, the name Nepal referred to something far smaller. It described only the Kathmandu Valley, a secluded basin hidden deep within the Himalayas. This ancient kingdom covered a relatively modest area, yet it became one of the most remarkable centers of civilization in South Asia. Protected by towering mountains and dense forests, the valley remained isolated from the outside world for centuries. Despite these natural barriers, it supported a surprisingly large population and nurtured a sophisticated culture that flourished in its own distinctive way. Reaching the valley was never easy. Travelers approaching from the south first had to cross the rugged foothills of the Himalayas, including the formidable Mahabharat Range and neighboring ridges before finally descending into the basin. Even after footpaths were established, the journey remained exhausting and dangerous. Ancient traditions describe routes haunted by wild animals and remote tribal communities, making travel a risky undertaking. Buddhist stories even recount that the Buddha discouraged some of his followers from attempting the crossing because of the hardships and dangers waiting along the mountain trails. Yet anyone who managed to enter the valley found a landscape unlike any other in the central Himalayas. Broad, level plains stretched across fertile ground, watered by countless streams flowing from the northern mountains. The climate was generally cool, but rainfall was plentiful enough to support dense vegetation and productive agriculture. Rich deposits of alluvial soil made farming exceptionally successful, while the local clay proved ideal for producing durable bricks. As a result, brick rather than stone became the dominant building material, giving the settlements of ancient Nepal a distinctive architectural character that differed from many neighboring regions. These favorable natural conditions transformed the Kathmandu Valley into an attractive destination for settlers from very early times. Generation after generation, different groups found their way into this isolated basin, each contributing something new to its society. Rather than remaining culturally uniform, the valley gradually developed into a meeting place where traditions blended together, creating a civilization shaped by centuries of migration and adaptation. The earliest arrivals were unlikely to have been large organized populations. More probably, they consisted of adventurous families or small communities willing to face the difficult mountain routes. The Bagmati River, carving its way south through the hills, most likely provided the easiest entrance into the valley and served as the main gateway for these pioneers. The first inhabitants, however, were not Indo-Aryans. Archaeological and historical evidence suggests that the earliest communities shared close ties with ancient tribal populations such as the Kols and Peels of the Indian subcontinent. Over time, groups with Dravidian roots also settled in the region. Later still came migrants speaking Tibeto-Burman languages. Many of these people had previously moved into northeastern India before gradually spreading westward through the Himalayan foothills. Eventually, some continued north into the Kathmandu Valley by following the upper reaches of the Bagmati River. Each wave of newcomers left its mark, gradually shaping the valley's ethnic and cultural identity. The valley itself tells an even older story. Geological evidence indicates that the entire basin was once occupied by a vast lake. Only a handful of hills rose above the water, standing like islands surrounded by an inland sea. As the waters eventually drained away through the gorge carved by the Bagmati River, they left behind deep layers of fertile sediment. This natural transformation produced exceptionally rich farmland, capable of yielding multiple harvests throughout the year. In many ways, the physical environment laid the foundation upon which Nepalese civilization would later emerge. Without the Bagmati River cutting its passage through the surrounding mountains, the valley might have remained almost completely isolated from neighboring civilizations. Instead, ideas, technologies, and religious traditions gradually filtered into the region without requiring large-scale population movements. Unlike many other parts of South Asia, the Kathmandu Valley experienced relatively little migration from the major cultural centers of western and northern India. Although a handful of ruling families and noble lineages from India occasionally established themselves in Nepal and exercised considerable political and cultural influence, they represented only a small elite rather than a mass migration. Their customs, religious beliefs, and administrative systems spread widely, but the local population itself remained largely unchanged in its ethnic composition. Because contact between the indigenous inhabitants and the Aryan populations of the Indian plains remained limited, the physical appearance of the valley's people continued to reflect a mixture of earlier populations. Their ancestry combined elements associated with Indo-Mongoloid communities as well as older Dravidian and Austroasiatic groups, preserving a unique ethnic identity even while absorbing many outside cultural influences. Long before many surrounding regions reached comparable levels of development, the Kathmandu Valley had already become home to thriving towns and organized urban life. Agriculture formed the backbone of the economy, supporting villages, artisans, merchants, and eventually prosperous cities. Like many ancient civilizations, however, economic progress was often slowed by internal rivalries and conservative elites determined to preserve traditional social structures. Even so, the valley developed a civilization closely connected to the broader traditions of ancient India while still maintaining its own local characteristics. Nature also favored this remarkable basin. Major floods and prolonged droughts were relatively uncommon, allowing agriculture to remain productive year after year. Winters could be harsh, but the spring and summer seasons provided excellent conditions for farming and daily life. Reliable harvests created food surpluses that supported specialized crafts, monumental architecture, religious institutions, and an aristocratic class able to patronize artists and craftsmen. Sculpture, architecture, and fine arts flourished, reflecting both local creativity and influences arriving from the Indian subcontinent. Many of the political institutions and cultural traditions introduced by rulers from the south gradually became woven into Nepalese society. Rather than replacing local customs, these influences merged with long-established traditions. The result was not simply an extension of Indian civilization into the Himalayas, but a culture that selectively adopted outside ideas while preserving its own distinctive identity. Throughout most of antiquity, communication with India remained far easier than travel across the towering Himalayan barrier to the north. Regular exchanges carried merchants, pilgrims, scholars, and religious teachers into the valley, ensuring that Indian philosophy, literature, religion, and artistic styles played a central role in shaping Nepalese civilization. By contrast, meaningful contact with Tibet remained extremely limited until around the 7th century AD, when political developments and expanding trade routes opened new channels across the mountains. Once these northern connections strengthened, Tibetan religious traditions, particularly forms of Buddhism that later evolved into Lamaism, began influencing the valley as well. Rather than abandoning its older heritage, Nepal absorbed these new elements into an already diverse cultural landscape. Over time, Kathmandu developed into a unique crossroads where Indian and Tibetan traditions met, interacted, and blended with older local customs. The civilization that emerged from this remarkable process belonged neither entirely to India nor entirely to Tibet. It was something uniquely Nepalese. Rooted in the fertile Kathmandu Valley, shaped by centuries of migration, protected by geography, and enriched through selective cultural exchange, ancient Nepal forged an identity unlike any other in the Himalayan world, one that preserved echoes of multiple civilizations while creating a tradition entirely its own. Although the customs and traditions of the Newar people preserve many echoes of ancient Nepal, the earliest chapter of the Kathmandu Valley's history remains largely hidden. Archaeological exploration has been limited, leaving historians with far more questions than answers. The exact date when the first people settled in the valley is still unknown, and it is impossible to determine whether those pioneers arrived as nomadic herders, early farmers, or members of already established communities. Even so, surviving traditions and comparisons with tribal societies in eastern India provide valuable clues about how life may have begun in this isolated Himalayan basin. The earliest settlers appear to have been more advanced than one might expect for such a remote region. They possessed pottery-making techniques that relied on the potter's wheel, producing decorated vessels rather than simple hand-shaped containers. They also demonstrated considerable skill in working with copper and bronze, while wood carving and metal craftsmanship gradually became important parts of daily life. The valley's rich clay deposits encouraged the production of strong, high-quality ceramics, helping pottery evolve into one of the defining crafts of early Nepalese society. Agriculture formed the foundation of this civilization, yet it developed in ways that differed from many neighboring regions. Farmers relied heavily on large spades and sturdy wooden tools to prepare the fields instead of animal-powered plows. Oxen were not commonly used for cultivation, possibly because the fertile soil required deeper digging than traditional plowing could achieve. Another possibility is that these communities continued farming methods inherited from northeastern India, where hand tools had long been favored over draft animals. Whatever the reason, agriculture adapted to local conditions rather than simply copying practices from elsewhere. The people also domesticated a variety of animals that supported everyday life. Water buffalo became particularly valuable, providing both milk and meat. Rice and wheat formed the principal crops, while other grains gradually became part of the agricultural landscape. Domestic birds such as chickens and ducks were also raised, contributing to a varied and dependable food supply that sustained the growing population. As new migrants gradually entered the Kathmandu Valley from the Indian plains, society began to change. These newcomers did not arrive empty-handed. They brought military knowledge, political organization, advanced technologies, and traditions associated with more hierarchical societies. Over time, many intermarried with influential local families, creating an emerging elite that slowly distinguished itself from the broader population. What had once been a largely tribal society began evolving into one where political authority and social status became increasingly concentrated in the hands of a ruling class. This transformation was not driven solely by culture, but also by politics. Contact with the civilizations of northern India introduced new ideas about governance and leadership. Gradually, hereditary privilege and organized administration replaced older forms of tribal decision-making, laying the groundwork for more centralized institutions that would dominate later Nepalese history. Transportation, however, remained remarkably simple. Wheeled vehicles drawn by oxen or other draft animals were unknown during the earliest periods. Instead, people relied on a practical carrying device that survives even today in some rural communities. Two woven baskets were suspended from either end of a long bamboo pole balanced across the shoulders, allowing farmers and traders to transport heavy loads across the rugged landscape. Similar carrying systems existed elsewhere in East and Southeast Asia, yet within Nepal they became particularly characteristic of the Kathmandu Valley. Large animals associated with royal power elsewhere in South Asia were absent from the valley's earliest history. Horses and elephants did not become familiar until much later, following the arrival of the Licchavis. Even then, these animals were never ideally suited to the local environment. While horses and elephants had already become symbols of prestige and military strength across the Indian subcontinent, their practical importance in Nepal remained limited for centuries. They seem to have been introduced more as part of imported political traditions than as animals that transformed everyday transportation or warfare. Among the many peoples who settled in the valley, the Kiratas appear to have exercised the strongest influence during the earliest historical period. Their traditions shaped much of the region's original cultural identity before later rulers introduced significant changes. When the Licchavis established themselves, they brought new administrative ideas, fresh artistic influences, and closer connections with the civilizations of northern India. Their arrival marked an important turning point, although many older customs survived alongside these innovations. Much about the homes of these early inhabitants remains uncertain. The same is true of their burial customs, which are still poorly understood. Clothing, however, offers a few clues. Descriptions preserved in early Chinese sources resemble garments that continued to be worn by several Himalayan communities for many centuries. Similar styles survived among groups such as the Kiratas, Gurungs, and Magas, suggesting a remarkable continuity in traditional dress across generations. Urban life also emerged gradually. Archaeological evidence for towns before the 4th century AD remains scarce, but the valley's geography strongly favored permanent settlement. The fertile plains encouraged agriculture, while abundant harvests created the surplus needed to support craftsmen, merchants, and administrators. Rather than remaining nomadic, the earliest inhabitants quickly established stable farming communities whose prosperity eventually gave rise to organized towns and expanding trade. Politically, early Nepal was probably governed as a collection of tribal republics rather than a centralized kingdom. Leadership likely rested with respected clan chiefs who ruled according to customary laws instead of absolute royal authority. In many respects, this structure resembled other republican traditions known from ancient northern India, particularly those associated with Vaishali. Over time, however, influential aristocratic families accumulated greater authority, eventually preparing the way for the emergence of monarchy. Religion during Nepal's prehistoric era remains one of the greatest mysteries. By the earliest historical period, both Hindu Shaivism and Buddhism had become firmly established in the valley, yet these faiths did not erase older traditions. Instead, they blended with long-standing local beliefs that had developed independently over countless generations. The result was a distinctive spiritual landscape in which imported philosophies merged with indigenous customs rather than replacing them entirely. Like many early agricultural societies around the world, the inhabitants of ancient Nepal believed that nature was inhabited by powerful spiritual forces. Mountains, forests, rivers, storms, and fertile fields were thought to possess supernatural beings capable of bringing prosperity or disaster. Rituals were performed to ensure abundant harvests, protect crops from natural calamities, and secure the well-being of the community. Offerings played an essential role in these ceremonies, and historical traditions suggest that, in very rare and exceptional circumstances, even human sacrifice may have formed part of ancient religious practices. Whether legendary or historical, such accounts are supported by the survival of ritual traditions that endured in isolated shrines until surprisingly recent times. Funeral ceremonies also occupied a central place in religious life. Death was believed to mark not an ending, but a dangerous transition, requiring elaborate rites to prevent restless spirits from disturbing the living. Proper rituals protected both the deceased and the community, reflecting a worldview in which the boundaries between the human and supernatural worlds remained constantly intertwined. One particularly striking feature of early Nepalese belief was the prominence of female divinities. Goddesses often occupied a more important position than male deities, a pattern shared with several other ancient societies in Eastern South Asia. Their association with fertility, protection, and the forces of nature reflected beliefs that likely stretched back to the Neolithic period. The artistic achievements of these earliest communities remain largely unknown because very little material has survived. Likewise, the origins of writing in Nepal are still debated. No indigenous script from the valley's earliest centuries has yet been discovered. Literacy probably expanded only after educated elites connected with northern India established themselves in Nepal. If so, writing initially remained the privilege of a small aristocratic class, while the local Newari language continued to flourish primarily as a spoken language rather than a literary one. This imbalance helps explain why the earliest centuries of Nepalese civilization remained so difficult to reconstruct. Without written records produced by the indigenous population, historians must rely on archaeology, foreign accounts, inscriptions, and surviving traditions to piece together the story. Even so, enough evidence survives to reveal a civilization that developed along its own path, shaped by fertile land, protected by mountains, enriched by migration, and distinguished by a unique blend of indigenous traditions and outside influences that together laid the foundations of Nepal's enduring cultural identity. The long-standing belief among many historians has been that the Newars arrived relatively late in the Kathmandu Valley. Yet a closer examination of Nepal's early history tells a very different story. Rather than appearing only in the historical period, the Newars may have been present centuries earlier, perhaps as far back as the 6th century BC. More importantly, the word Newar originally referred less to a single race than to the people who inhabited the Kathmandu Valley itself. Over time, the community absorbed migrants from many different backgrounds, gradually transforming into a culturally unified population despite its diverse ancestry. In its earliest phase, the valley was likely occupied by people with Ostroid roots who later mixed with migrants possessing Mongoloid and possibly Dravidian ancestry. These successive waves of settlement created a population that could not be defined by a single ethnic origin. Instead, the Nuars emerged through centuries of interaction, intermarriage, and cultural exchange, making them one of the most distinctive communities in the Himalayan region. Although archaeological evidence remains limited, the surviving traces of material culture suggest that these early inhabitants were far from primitive. They had already mastered pottery production using the potter's wheel, allowing them to create finely decorated ceramic vessels rather than simple handmade containers. Skilled craftsmen worked with copper and bronze, while wood carving gradually developed into one of the valley's defining artistic traditions. The abundance of rich clay encouraged the production of exceptionally durable pottery, laying the foundation for an enduring ceramic culture that would continue for centuries. Agriculture quickly became the economic backbone of these settlements, but local farming practices evolved according to the valley's unique environment. Instead of relying on ox-drawn plows, farmers preferred heavy digging spades and wooden earth breakers. The deep, fertile soil rewarded careful manual cultivation, making this method more effective than conventional plowing. Some historians also believe these techniques reflected farming traditions carried from northeastern India, where hand cultivation had long remained common before migration into Nepal. Domestic animals also played an important role in everyday life. Water buffalo were especially valuable because they supplied both milk and meat. Rice and wheat formed the principal food crops, while other grains gradually supplemented the agricultural economy. Chickens and ducks were among the earliest domesticated birds, providing additional food resources for growing communities. As migration from the Indian plains increased, the social landscape began to change. These newcomers introduced more than new faces. They brought organized political traditions, superior military techniques, and a more hierarchical understanding of society. Gradually, influential immigrant families merged with prominent local lineages through alliances and marriage. From this process emerged an aristocratic class that increasingly separated itself from the wider population and eventually dominated political leadership. The transformation marked the beginning of social stratification in what had previously been a largely tribal society. Authority became concentrated among privileged families, replacing older systems of communal leadership. Political influence from northern India therefore reshaped not only government, but also the structure of society itself. Transportation during this period remained remarkably simple. There is no evidence that carts pulled by oxen or other draft animals were used in the Kathmandu Valley. Instead, people relied on a practical carrying device consisting of two baskets suspended from either end of a bamboo pole balanced across the shoulders. This efficient system allowed individuals to move agricultural products and goods across mountainous terrain, where wheeled transport would have been impractical. Similar carrying methods appeared elsewhere in East and Southeast Asia, but within Nepal they became especially characteristic of valley life. Large animals associated with royal power elsewhere in South Asia were absent from the earliest stages of Nepalese civilization. Horses and elephants entered the valley only after the rise of the Licchavis. Even then, they never became common features of ordinary transportation because the mountainous environment limited their usefulness. Their arrival reflected stronger political and cultural links with northern India rather than a fundamental change in local daily life. Among all the peoples who influenced early Nepal, the Kiratas occupy a particularly important place. Historical traditions consistently associate them with the earliest chapters of Nepalese history, suggesting that they played a major role in shaping the valley before later dynasties emerged. Ancient Indian literature frequently mentions the Kiratas as mountain peoples inhabiting the eastern Himalayas. References in the Mahabharata, the Ramayana, and numerous classical texts portray them as skilled hunters, fierce warriors, and inhabitants of remote highland regions. Some accounts even describe them as allies of powerful eastern kingdoms, while others associate them with valuable mountain products, trade, and distinctive cultural traditions. Historical evidence suggests that the Kiratas once occupied a much larger territory, stretching across parts of northern India before gradually retreating into the Himalayan foothills as Indo-Aryan expansion continued eastward. By roughly the 6th century BC, they had become concentrated in the eastern Himalayan region, where they maintained political independence despite increasing cultural interaction with neighboring civilizations. The Bagmati River appears to have served as the principal route through which the Kiratas entered the Kathmandu Valley. They initially settled in its southern districts before gradually expanding eastward and westward across the basin. Archaeological patterns support this interpretation, as many of the valley's oldest settlements are concentrated near the confluence of the Bagmati and Vishnumati rivers rather than in later urban centers. Over time, the Kiratas mixed extensively with the earlier inhabitants of the valley, particularly among farming and artisan communities. This blending gradually softened clear ethnic distinctions while preserving many physical and cultural characteristics that survived for generations. Even place names found in some of Nepal's earliest inscriptions may preserve traces of these ancient pre-Mongoloid or Mongoloid-speaking communities, offering valuable clues to the valley's earliest population history. Despite the gradual spread of Hinduism and Buddhism into Nepal, the earliest inhabitants retained many beliefs inherited from much older traditions. Like numerous Neolithic farming societies across Asia, they viewed the natural world as inhabited by powerful spirits capable of influencing harvests, weather, health, and prosperity. Mountains, rivers, forests, and fertile fields were believed to possess supernatural forces that required constant respect and ritual attention. Religious ceremonies centered on ensuring agricultural fertility and protecting communities from natural disasters beyond human control. Offerings formed an essential part of these rituals, and traditions preserved in later Nepalese history suggest that extraordinary sacrifices, including occasional human offerings, may once have been performed to appease particularly powerful deities. Whether entirely historical or partly legendary, these accounts reflect the deep importance of ritual within early Himalayan society. Funeral customs were equally elaborate. Death was regarded not simply as the end of life, but as a dangerous transition requiring careful ceremonies to prevent the deceased from becoming a wandering spirit capable of troubling the living. These beliefs shaped burial and memorial practices for centuries and remained deeply rooted even after Buddhism and Hinduism became dominant religions. Another striking feature of ancient Nepalese spirituality was the prominence of female divinities. Goddesses often occupied a higher position than male gods within local religious practice, reflecting fertility-centered beliefs common among early agricultural societies. Similar traditions also appeared in neighboring regions such as Bengal, suggesting a broader prehistoric religious heritage that survived beneath later Hindu and Buddhist influences. The origins of writing in Nepal remain uncertain. No indigenous script from the valley's earliest centuries has yet been identified. Literacy likely expanded only after educated elites connected with northern India established themselves in the region, bringing writing systems, administrative records, and literary traditions with them. Because literacy remained concentrated among aristocratic and religious circles, the local Nuari language continued primarily as a spoken language for many centuries. This helps explain why written accounts of Nepal's earliest civilization are so scarce and why much of its ancient history must still be reconstructed through archaeology, inscriptions, foreign records, and enduring oral traditions. Far from being an isolated backwater, early Nepal developed into a remarkably resilient civilization that blended indigenous traditions with outside influences, while preserving a cultural identity unlike any other in the Himalayas. Its people adapted to a unique environment, absorbed newcomers without losing their own character, and laid the foundations for one of South Asia's most distinctive historical cultures. For many years, historians accepted the idea that the Kiratas were the earliest known inhabitants of the Kathmandu Valley. Ancient chronicles, supported by references in the Puranas, consistently describe them as the first rulers of the region. Yet, another community, the Nuars, has always stood at the center of Nepal's cultural history. Although they preserved the valley's traditions, architecture, language, and urban life, they are mentioned far less frequently in early literary sources. This contrast has raised an important historical question. Were the Nuars a later people, or were they in fact the descendants of the ancient Kiratas themselves? Linguistic evidence strongly favors the second possibility. By the 5th century AD, Inscriptions written in Sanskrit already preserve numerous place names and personal names that clearly originated in the Newari language. These names have survived with remarkably little change into modern times, demonstrating that a Newari-speaking population had long been established in the valley. The use of Sanskrit in official inscriptions does not suggest that Newari had disappeared. Rather, Sanskrit functioned as the language of administration, religion, and educated elites, while Newari remained the language spoken by the overwhelming majority of ordinary people. This situation resembles many civilizations in which an official literary language coexisted alongside the everyday speech of the population. The historical sequence also makes it clear that the Newars occupied the Kathmandu Valley before the arrival of the Licchavis. While traditional chronicles describe the Licchavis as conquerors of the Kiratas, it is difficult to imagine that an entire population disappeared following a political defeat. Communities that have lived in the same homeland for centuries rarely abandon it completely. More likely, the Kiratas remained in the valley after losing political control and gradually evolved into the people later known as the Newars. This interpretation also explains another historical puzzle. Ancient legal texts, such as the Manusmriti, describe the Kiratas as an important and respected people, yet the modern Kirata communities occupy remote mountain regions that remained relatively isolated from the major centers of civilization. Their cultural development differs greatly from that of the highly urbanized and artistically sophisticated Newars. If the Kiratas had truly vanished from the Kathmandu Valley, one would expect traces of their advanced civilization elsewhere. Instead, many historians argue that those who remained in the valley gradually developed into the Newar community, while related groups living in more isolated regions followed a different historical path. Religion provides another important clue. The Kathmandu Valley became one of the earliest centers of both Buddhism and Shaivism in the Himalayan world. Ancient stupas, temples, and religious monuments reveal strong cultural links with northern India, particularly during the Mauryan period. Even if Emperor Ashoka himself never entered the valley, there is little doubt that Buddhist influence reached Nepal very early. The impressive stupas scattered throughout Kathmandu closely resemble those found across the Gangetic Plains, indicating continuous religious and artistic exchange. Modern Kirata communities, however, preserved far fewer signs of these early Buddhist influences. This contrast has encouraged some scholars to conclude that the present-day Kiratas should not automatically be identified with the Kiratas described in ancient chronicles. Instead, they may represent only one branch of a much larger population, while another branch remained in the Kathmandu Valley and gradually became the Newars. In this interpretation, the Newars inherited both the political traditions and much of the cultural legacy once associated with the ancient Kiratas. Language further strengthens this connection. Although Newari and the modern Kirati languages are distinct, they share enough structural characteristics to suggest a distant relationship. Centuries of geographical separation, combined with contact with different neighboring peoples, naturally produced significant linguistic differences. Physical appearance also changed over time as both populations mixed with local communities, yet underlying similarities remain visible, pointing toward a shared ancestral background rather than entirely separate origins. Ancient legends also support this broader interpretation. They consistently identify the Kiratas as the first rulers of the Kathmandu Valley, but these traditions may not refer simply to a vanished ethnic group. Instead, they could preserve the memory of the earliest settled population whose descendants eventually became known under a different name. Such an explanation resolves the apparent contradiction between the disappearance of the Kiratas from political history and the uninterrupted cultural continuity visible in the Newar civilization. Anthropological studies provide additional evidence regarding the origins of the Newars. Many scholars believe that their distant ancestors belong to the same broad population movements that carried Mongoloid-speaking peoples into the Himalayan foothills during the 6th and 7th centuries BC. These migrants were distinct from the earlier Dravidian and pre-Dravidian populations of the Indian subcontinent. Their physical features, including broad faces, prominent cheekbones, relatively small noses, sparse facial hair, and shorter stature, closely resemble those found among numerous communities living today in northeastern India and the eastern Himalayas. The Nuas, however, never remained isolated. Continuous contact with peoples from the Indian plains gradually altered their appearance through centuries of intermarriage. As a result, while their Mongoloid heritage remained clearly visible, many individuals also displayed facial features associated with Indo-Aryan populations. This combination produced the distinctive appearance that continues to characterize many Nuas today. Similar processes of cultural and biological blending can also be observed among neighboring Himalayan peoples, such as the Tharus and Rajbansis, although each community followed its own unique historical development. The origin of the name Nua is closely tied to the history of Nepal itself. Most scholars agree that the people and the country have been linked since antiquity. The earliest known reference to Nepal appears in the writings of Kautilya, who mentioned the region in connection with its famous woolen blankets. Over the centuries, numerous explanations for the word Nepal have been proposed, ranging from legendary sages to sacred trees. But many researchers consider these stories to be later inventions rather than genuine historical explanations. A more convincing interpretation traces the name to ancient Kirati vocabulary. In several Himalayan and Tibeto-Burman languages, words resembling Ni refer to a dwelling place, sacred location, or settled region. Combined with other local linguistic elements, the name gradually evolved into Nepal, while Nua became the term used for the inhabitants of that land. Over many centuries, ordinary pronunciations slowly transformed older forms into the modern names familiar today. Ironically, although the Nuas were almost certainly far older than many later ruling dynasties, the name Nua itself appears relatively late in surviving historical records. European Capuchin missionaries first recorded the word during the 17th century, and it later appeared in 18th century Nepalese literature. By then, however, the community had already existed for many centuries, preserving traditions, language, craftsmanship, and urban culture that reached back to the very earliest history of the Kathmandu Valley. One of the most debated questions in early Nepalese history concerns the identity of the Licchavis. Were they an Indo-Aryan ruling dynasty that entered the Kathmandu Valley from the plains of northern India, or did they belong to one of the many non-Aryan peoples who inhabited the Himalayan region? Historians have argued both positions for generations, drawing upon ancient literature, inscriptions, and religious texts in an effort to determine their true origins. Supporters of an Aryan origin point to several pieces of evidence. The Licchavis participated in the famous Vriji Confederacy alongside states such as the Videhas and Mallas. Classical Sanskrit literature often associates them with the Kshatriya warrior class, while Buddhist traditions record that they claimed a share of the Buddha's relics on the basis of their royal lineage. Jain sources likewise trace their ancestry to ancient dynasties connected with Kuru and Ikshvaku traditions. At first glance, these references appear to place the Licchavis firmly within the Indo-Aryan political world. Yet these arguments are not as decisive as they may seem. Membership in a political alliance does not necessarily imply common ethnic origins. The Vriji Confederacy united several independent peoples for mutual protection and cooperation rather than shared ancestry. Likewise, participation in Buddhist ceremonies or claims of Kshatriya descent were common among many ancient communities seeking prestige and legitimacy. Such traditions cannot by themselves prove that the Licchavis belong to an Aryan population. Ancient legal texts introduce additional complexity. The Manusmriti classifies the Licchavis among the Vratiyas, a category applied to peoples who stood outside orthodox Brahmanical society. Interestingly, this same classification included groups such as the Kiratas, Khasas, and Dravidians, communities whose origins were clearly diverse. Rather than serving as evidence of ethnicity, the label seems to reflect religious practice and social customs that differed from mainstream Brahmanical traditions. As a result, the text offers little certainty regarding the racial background of the Licchavis themselves. This ambiguity becomes even clearer when examining broader patterns in ancient Indian society. Powerful tribes from many different backgrounds were often incorporated into the prestigious Kshatriya tradition regardless of their original ancestry. Political influence and cultural integration frequently mattered more than ethnic origin. Consequently, references describing the Licchavis as Kshatriyas reveal how they were viewed within society rather than providing conclusive evidence of where they came from. Historical records indicate that the Licchavis emerged as an independent political force only after the decline of the Videhan monarchy. Earlier, Brahmanical traditions barely mention them as a separate republic, suggesting that their rise to prominence occurred relatively late compared with some neighboring states. This timing supports the idea that the Licchavis became influential through changing political circumstances rather than representing one of the oldest ruling lineages in northern India. What is beyond dispute is the profound impact the Licchavis had on Nepal after establishing their rule in the Kathmandu Valley. For several centuries, they governed the region, bringing administrators, soldiers, merchants, priests, and craftsmen from the plains. These newcomers did not remain an isolated colonial elite. Instead, they gradually merged with the existing population through intermarriage and everyday interaction. Over generations, distinctions between immigrant and indigenous communities became increasingly blurred until the descendants of the Licchavis became fully integrated into Nuar society. The same process had already taken place with earlier Kirata settlers. Rather than replacing one another, successive populations contributed to a continuously evolving society. The Kathmandu Valley became a cultural melting pot where older inhabitants, immigrant elites, artisans, merchants, and farming communities all participated in the gradual formation of a shared civilization. By the medieval period, neither Kirata nor Licchavi existed as separate ethnic communities. Both had become inseparable components of the broader Nuar population. Although the Licchavis eventually blended into Nepalese society, they were clearly distinct from the earliest inhabitants of the valley. Their homeland lay around Vaishali in northern India, close enough to Nepal to encourage frequent contact. This geographical proximity made migration relatively easy, allowing the Licchavis to establish political authority while simultaneously absorbing many local customs. They conquered the valley not as strangers entering an unknown world, but as neighbors already connected through trade, diplomacy, and shared religious traditions. The relationship between the Nuars and the ancient Vriji Confederacy therefore appears to have been primarily cultural rather than purely ethnic. The Vriji League itself included peoples of varied backgrounds, making it entirely plausible that the ancestors of the Nuars participated in this broader political network. Ancient writers located several members of the Confederacy in the Himalayan region, and not all of these groups have been identified with certainty. This leaves open the possibility that the Nuars formed one branch of the wider Vriji world long before the rise of the Licchavi dynasty. The internal organization of early Nuar society also points toward republican rather than monarchical traditions. Unlike Orthodox Hindu society, the Buddhist Nuars possessed no hereditary Brahmin priesthood. Religious duties were instead performed by former monks and ritual specialists whose titles reflected their Buddhist origins. Social hierarchy certainly existed, yet the rigid caste system characteristic of the Indian plains developed only gradually and remained significantly different from its southern counterpart. Even the Newari word for king hints at a political culture unlike absolute monarchy. Rather than emphasizing unlimited royal authority, the title suggests a ruler whose role depended upon collective approval. Many scholars believe that the earliest Nuar communities preferred decision-making through assemblies similar to those practiced in Vaishali, where councils rather than individual monarchs exercised supreme authority. If so, the political traditions of the Kathmandu Valley preserved important elements of an older republican heritage that survived long after neighboring regions embraced centralized kingdoms. Cultural continuity offers further evidence of these ancient connections. Certain Nuar communities continue to preserve the old designation Vadje, a name remarkably similar to Vriji. Whether this resemblance is coincidental or historical remains debated, but it provides another intriguing link between Nepal and the republican states of northern India. Religious practices strengthen this connection even more. Chaitya worship occupies a central place in traditional Nuar culture. These small shrines, often containing relics or serving as symbolic resting places for ancestral spirits, represent one of the oldest forms of religious architecture in Nepal. Similar traditions were deeply rooted in ancient Vaishali, suggesting a common cultural heritage extending back many centuries. Historical accounts even claim that numerous chaityas already stood throughout the Kathmandu Valley by the time of Emperor Ashoka, demonstrating how firmly established these practices had become. Closely associated with chaitya worship is belief in supernatural beings known today as Kya. These figures appear to preserve elements of the much older Yaksha tradition found throughout ancient South Asia. In Nuar belief, a Kaya possesses the power to grant wealth and prosperity to those it favors, and offerings are still made to these spirits in certain traditional rituals. Although Yakshas also appear in Hindu and Buddhist mythology, their continued importance within Nuar culture reflects the survival of religious traditions that predate both organized Hinduism and Buddhism. Ultimately, these customs reveal something far more significant than questions of ethnic ancestry. They demonstrate that the Kathmandu Valley shared deep cultural ties with the Republican societies of northern India while simultaneously preserving its own indigenous traditions. Whether the Nuars descended directly from the Kiratas, emerged from a broader Vriji confederation, or developed through the gradual blending of many different peoples, their civilization cannot be explained by a single migration or a single dynasty. Instead, it grew through centuries of cultural exchange, political adaptation, and social integration, producing one of the most distinctive and enduring civilizations anywhere in the Himalayan world. The Nuars stand among the oldest continuously living communities of the Himalayan world. Their origins remain shrouded in uncertainty, yet their cultural legacy is unmistakable. Over many centuries, they transformed the Kathmandu Valley into one of Asia's great artistic and religious centers, leaving behind a remarkable tradition of architecture, sculpture, craftsmanship, and urban life. Few societies have shaped the identity of Nepal as profoundly as the Nuars, whose influence became so deeply woven into the country's history that the story of Nepal itself cannot be told without them. Exactly when the Nuars first settled in the Kathmandu Valley remains unknown. Ancient Sanskrit texts appear to mention Nepal, but determining whether those references specifically describe the Kathmandu Valley continues to challenge historians. What seems increasingly likely is that the people later known as the Nuars originally bore another name. This would explain why they are largely absent from many of the earliest historical records, despite their obvious importance in the region's development. The name Nuar itself probably evolved gradually from older forms associated with Nepal, reflecting the long linguistic changes that naturally occur over centuries. Legends claiming that the Nuars migrated from the Indian plains contain elements of truth but should not be interpreted literally. Rather than describing the origin of the entire community, these traditions most likely preserve memories of influential immigrant families who arrived from northern India during different periods of history. Dynasties such as the Licchavis from Vaishali and the Mallas from Pawapuri eventually became part of Nuar society through marriage, political integration, and cultural exchange. They enriched an already existing civilization instead of creating it from the beginning. This ability to absorb newcomers became one of the defining strengths of Nuar civilization. Throughout the medieval period, the Kathmandu Valley continued welcoming migrants from neighboring regions. Families from Mithila, Bengal, Uttar Pradesh, and other parts of northern India gradually settled among the Nuars. Although many initially preserved their own customs and social identities, successive generations increasingly adopted the language, traditions, and way of life of the valley. Some communities retained distinct marriage practices, but in almost every other respect, they became inseparable parts of Nuar society. The question of Nuar origins has fascinated historians for generations, yet no single explanation fully accounts for their remarkable diversity. Attempts to classify them as purely Aryan, purely Mongoloid, or immigrants from Tibet all fail to explain the complexity visible within the population itself. The Nuars instead represent the product of centuries of migration, interaction, and cultural blending. Their ancestry reflects multiple populations rather than one exclusive ethnic source. Anthropological evidence points most strongly toward northeastern India as the region from which many of the earliest ancestors of the Nuars originated. Comparisons of facial features and physical characteristics reveal striking similarities with communities inhabiting Assam, Manipur, northern Bengal, and neighboring Himalayan regions. While certain Nuars display obvious Indo-Mongoloid characteristics, others reveal stronger Indo-Aryan influences acquired through centuries of intermarriage. This diversity reflects a long process of assimilation rather than a single migration event. The descendants of the Licchavis and Mallas represent one important example of this cultural fusion. Although these immigrant families introduced Aryan traditions into the Kathmandu Valley, they themselves gradually adopted Nuari customs, language, and social practices. Over time, differences between indigenous inhabitants and immigrant elites became increasingly blurred. Family names sometimes preserved memories of these outside origins, yet everyday life reflected a common Nuar identity shaped by shared history rather than ancestry alone. Religion became perhaps the greatest symbol of this remarkable spirit of integration. Few places in the medieval world displayed such peaceful coexistence between different faiths as the Kathmandu Valley. Buddhism and Shaivite Hinduism developed side by side for centuries without producing the deep divisions that characterized many other societies. Temples welcomed followers of both traditions, and acts of mutual respect became an ordinary part of daily religious life. A Buddhist honored Hindu shrines just as a Shaivite showed reverence toward Buddhist sacred places. This extraordinary atmosphere of harmony became one of the defining characteristics of Nuar civilization. This religious tolerance did not emerge by accident. Throughout its history, Kathmandu remained open to travelers, monks, merchants, and teachers arriving from many different regions. Each introduced new philosophical ideas and religious traditions that gradually blended with older local beliefs. Instead of rejecting unfamiliar practices, Nuar society generally incorporated them into an increasingly rich spiritual landscape. The result was not religious uniformity, but an enduring culture of coexistence that allowed diverse traditions to flourish together. One of the most influential forces behind this unity was Tantric worship. Tantric traditions spread widely throughout the Kathmandu Valley and profoundly shaped both Buddhist and Hindu religious practice. Unlike many orthodox systems, Tantrism often emphasized spiritual experience over rigid social distinctions. Temples influenced by Tantric traditions welcomed worshippers from different castes and religious backgrounds, creating spaces where communities that might otherwise have remained separate participated together in shared rituals. In many respects, this represented a remarkably progressive development for its time. Even communities regarded as untouchable elsewhere in South Asia gained access to temples within the Kathmandu Valley. In certain shrines, they even served as religious attendants, illustrating a degree of social inclusion that remained unusual across much of the medieval world. Tantric influence therefore weakened some of the rigid barriers that divided society and encouraged a broader sense of religious equality. Yet Tantrism also introduced practices that many observers regarded as disturbing. Elaborate ritual systems gradually replaced the relative simplicity of earlier forms of worship. Animal sacrifice assumed increasingly dramatic and sometimes brutal forms, particularly during ceremonies involving buffalo offerings. Complex symbolic gestures, intricate ritual procedures, masked dances, and dramatic performances became central features of major religious festivals. While these customs enriched the ceremonial life of the valley, they also introduced layers of ritual complexity that transformed Nuar religion into something highly distinctive. Many historians view these developments as a mixed legacy. On one hand, Tantric traditions preserved ancient beliefs, encouraged artistic expression, and united communities that followed different religious paths. On the other, they sometimes promoted elaborate ritualism, extreme sacrificial practices, and forms of worship that appeared increasingly distant from the original teachings of either Buddhism or Hinduism. The religious life of the Nuars thus became a unique blend of philosophical sophistication, ancient local traditions, artistic symbolism, and ceremonial complexity unlike that found elsewhere in Asia. This distinctive synthesis also strengthened Nepal's cultural connections with Tibet. Tantric Buddhism became one of the major channels through which religious ideas crossed the Himalayas, allowing newer artists, craftsmen, monks, and merchants to influence Tibetan civilization while simultaneously absorbing elements of Tibetan culture themselves. As a result, Nuwa civilization emerged as a remarkable bridge between the civilizations of India and Tibet, preserving ancient traditions from both while creating an identity that remained unmistakably its own. Among the many civilizations that flourished in the Himalayas, few developed a cultural life as vibrant as that of the Nuwas. Festivals shaped the rhythm of everyday existence to such an extent that celebration became almost inseparable from ordinary life. Throughout the year, scarcely a week passed without a procession, religious ceremony, or communal gathering. Streets echoed with traditional music, temple bells, and ritual chants, while homes were transformed into centers of worship and hospitality. Food, drink, and elaborate ceremonies accompanied nearly every occasion, reflecting a society in which religious devotion and social life were deeply intertwined. Public performances formed an equally important part of these celebrations. Ritual dances featuring gods, demons, and legendary heroes filled temple courtyards and public squares with dramatic spectacles. Performers wore carefully crafted masks representing divine and supernatural beings, while every movement followed symbolic traditions preserved through generations. These dances were not simple entertainment, but sacred performances intended to communicate religious ideas and preserve ancient myths. Among the most impressive festivals was Indra Jatra, during which one remarkable performance reenacted the struggle between Bhairava and a buffalo demon. In this ceremony, a living buffalo represented the mythical adversary, while dancers portraying Bhairava and his attendants staged an intense ritual battle. The performance concluded with the symbolic defeat of the demon, representing the triumph of divine power over destructive forces. Such dramatic ceremonies attracted nobles and ordinary townspeople alike, becoming one of the great public events of the Kathmandu Valley. Underlying many of these celebrations was a widespread belief in invisible supernatural beings capable of influencing human life. The Nuwas regarded the world as inhabited by spirits whose favor had to be secured and whose anger had to be avoided. Numerous annual festivals therefore focused on protecting communities from harmful forces rather than simply commemorating historical events. Ceremonies such as Gantakana and other ritual observances sought to expel evil spirits from towns and villages, reinforcing the belief that neglecting these traditions might invite misfortune upon the community. The annual religious calendar included celebrations dedicated to family ancestors, local temples, departed relatives, and major Hindu and Buddhist deities. The new year began with ceremonies honoring family gods, accompanied by communal gatherings that reunited relatives from different households. Other festivals paid tribute to sacred animals, celebrated successful harvests, or filled neighborhoods with devotional songs praising Vishnu. Buddhist priests also participated in annual processions, collecting offerings while maintaining centuries-old religious traditions that continued to bind communities together. The remarkable survival of these customs depended largely upon one unique social institution known as the Guthi. Rather than allowing religious ceremonies to rely solely on individual generosity, newer families permanently dedicated portions of their land and property to support traditional rituals. These endowments could neither be sold nor divided among heirs. Income generated from the property financed festivals, temple maintenance, and family ceremonies generation after generation. In this way, the Guthi system acted not only as an economic institution, but also as the guardian of Nuwa cultural identity, ensuring that even political upheavals and changing times could not easily erase centuries of tradition. Marriage customs reveal another distinctive feature of Nuwa society. Unlike many neighboring traditions, the principal marriage ritual originally centered almost entirely on the bride rather than the groom. Even more remarkable was the belief that every girl first entered into a sacred symbolic marriage during childhood. Around the age of 6, she was ceremonially united with the divine through a golden image associated with the sacred bell fruit. This ritual established an eternal spiritual marriage that could never be broken. Later, human marriage was regarded as an earthly relationship, important but secondary to the earlier divine union. Because of this belief, widowhood never carried the same religious stigma found in many other South Asian societies. Widows retained their spiritual status and were permitted to remarry. Despite these protections for women, Nuar society also contained clear inequalities. Divorce existed but generally favored men, leaving women with comparatively limited rights. Another unusual custom appeared when marriages crossed caste boundaries. Children often inherited the social identity of their mother rather than that of their father, preserving traces of older matrilineal traditions that had largely disappeared elsewhere in South Asia. Even as modern influences transformed daily life, annual festivals and communal gatherings continued to reinforce the strong sense of collective identity that had long distinguished Nuar society. The Nuar caste system developed differently from the more familiar Hindu model found across much of India. Its earliest foundations appear to have been closely connected with Buddhist ideals, emphasizing renunciation and religious learning. Many traditional caste names reflected spiritual rather than hereditary occupations. Over time, however, centuries of political and cultural influence gradually reshaped this system. Hierarchies became more rigid, social distinctions deepened, and priestly classes emerged. Although Buddhist principles remained important, Nuar society increasingly reflected many of the same social divisions found elsewhere on the subcontinent. Yet important differences remained. The agricultural community known as the Jiapus formed the economic backbone of the valley, providing food for the entire population despite often occupying a lower social position. Traditional Nuar society also lacked several occupational castes commonly found in India, and untouchable groups entered the community largely through later immigration rather than indigenous development. This gave the Nuar social structure a character distinct from the orthodox caste hierarchy of the plains. Economically, the Nuars became famous as merchants, craftsmen, and skilled artisans. Apart from farming communities, most Nuars devoted themselves to trade, commerce, manufacturing, and specialized crafts. Their commercial networks spread throughout Nepal, making them indispensable to the country's economy. Their reputation for business skill became so well established that the title Bhaju, meaning merchant, became closely associated with Nuar identity. Their adaptability also enabled many families to occupy influential positions within the civil administration, while simultaneously preserving their dominant role in trade and industry. Language represented another cornerstone of Nuar civilization. Nuari developed into one of the oldest and most refined languages of the Himalayan world. Although greatly enriched by Sanskrit vocabulary over the centuries, its fundamental grammatical structure belonged to the Tibeto-Burman language family rather than the Indo-Aryan branch. This combination produced a language unlike either Sanskrit or Tibetan, preserving its own unique character despite centuries of cultural contact with both civilizations. Many words entered Nuari from Sanskrit, particularly those connected with religion, administration, and literature. Yet these borrowed terms were reshaped to fit the language's own phonetic patterns. At the same time, comparisons with Tibetan reveal that similarities between the two languages remain relatively limited. Their shared monosyllabic character reflects distant linguistic relationships rather than direct descent, demonstrating that Nuari evolved independently while interacting with multiple neighboring traditions. The Nuars also developed several distinctive writing systems derived from Indian scripts. Forms such as Ranjana, Bujimol, and other Nuari scripts became important vehicles for preserving religious literature, historical documents, and artistic manuscripts. Although influenced by the broader Indian writing tradition, these scripts evolved into elegant local forms that reflected the creative achievements of Nuar scholars and scribes. Perhaps no contribution better symbolizes Nuar civilization than its architecture. The famous pagoda style, now associated with much of East Asia, achieved some of its earliest and finest expressions in the Kathmandu Valley. Multi-tiered temples with gracefully projecting roofs, richly carved wooden supports, and finely decorated facades transformed the valley into one of the world's great architectural landscapes. The temples of Kathmandu, Bhaktapur, and Patan continue to display extraordinary craftsmanship, reflecting centuries of artistic refinement and technical mastery. The influence of Nuar civilization extended far beyond Nepal itself. Following the spread of Buddhism into Tibet during the 7th century, Nuar artists, architects, scribes, and craftsmen became instrumental in transmitting Indian religious knowledge across the Himalayas. Tibetan writing developed under strong influence from Indian scripts introduced through Nepal, while countless Sanskrit texts reached Tibet through Nuar scholars and translators. These works played a crucial role in preserving Indian Buddhist literature long after many originals disappeared from the subcontinent. Through their artistic achievements, intellectual traditions, and cultural exchanges, the Nuars became one of the principal bridges connecting the civilizations of India and Tibet, leaving a legacy that shaped the history of the entire Himalayan world. Throughout its history, the Kathmandu Valley never existed in complete isolation from the civilizations of the Indian subcontinent. Geography ensured constant interaction between the fertile Himalayan basin and the vast Indo-Gangetic plain. No formidable natural barrier separated the valley from the regions to its south, allowing merchants, pilgrims, scholars, and rulers to travel across the mountains for centuries. As a result, political ideas, religious movements, artistic traditions, and commercial networks flowed freely into Nepal, while local culture developed its own distinctive identity. Ancient tradition even suggests that Nepal maintained connections with the wider Indian world during the age of the Mahabharata. Whether or not every legendary account reflects historical fact, there is little doubt that Buddhism reached the Kathmandu Valley at an early period. Later, powerful dynasties such as the Mauryas, Licchavis, Kushans, Guptas, Thakuris, Mallas, and Shahs all established political influence within Nepal. Yet this should not be mistaken for foreign domination. Throughout these centuries, Nepal preserved its political independence, and even rulers whose ancestors originated on the plains governed the valley as an autonomous kingdom rather than as a distant colony. For much of early history, the name Nepal referred only to the Kathmandu Valley itself rather than the larger nation known today. Although geographically small, the valley functioned as the political, cultural, and economic heart of the Himalayan kingdom. Decisions made within its cities shaped the destiny of surrounding mountain regions, while its artisans, merchants, and religious institutions projected influence far beyond its modest boundaries. Even after the decline of Nuar political power, the valley retained unmistakable signs of its glorious past. Medieval temples, carved monuments, ancient courtyards, and centuries-old customs continued to fascinate visitors. Every street revealed traces of extraordinary craftsmanship, reminding observers that the Nuars had once produced one of the richest artistic traditions in Asia. Their monuments remained enduring witnesses to a civilization whose influence greatly exceeded the size of the land that created it. The remarkable artistic achievements of the Kathmandu Valley were no accident. Geography played a decisive role in their development. Situated in the heart of the Himalayas, the valley occupied an ideal crossroads connecting northern India with Tibet and western China through ancient trade routes. Fertile farmland supported a dense population, while abundant clay, timber, and other natural resources supplied builders and craftsmen with exceptional materials. Combined with a mild climate favorable to preserving wood and brick structures, these conditions created an environment where architecture and sculpture could flourish over many centuries. The earliest settlers of the valley are believed to have belonged to communities with strong Mongoloid roots who gradually mixed with later arrivals from neighboring regions. Their original beliefs centered upon animism, with mountains, forests, rivers, and natural forces regarded as living spiritual powers. The arrival of Buddhism transformed this worldview rather than replacing it. Indigenous traditions acquired a philosophical framework while simultaneously inspiring new forms of artistic expression. Simple shrines evolved into monumental stupas, and modest ritual objects gradually gave way to increasingly refined sculpture, architecture, and religious symbolism. Among the oldest surviving monuments of this transformation are the ancient stupas of Patan. These structures rank among the earliest Buddhist architectural remains in Nepal and are traditionally associated with Emperor Ashoka. 4 stand at the cardinal points of the ancient city, while another occupies its center, forming a sacred landscape that has survived for centuries. Whether or not they were personally commissioned by Ashoka, they preserve architectural forms that belong to the earliest phases of Buddhist monument building. Their design is striking in its simplicity. Massive hemispherical domes rise from brick platforms with almost no external ornamentation. Small shrines crown the summit, while hidden chambers within the structures served ceremonial purposes. Images of the meditating Buddhas, placed around later editions, reveal the gradual influence of Mahayana Buddhism upon these originally austere monuments. Rather than overwhelming the observer with decoration, the stupas achieve their beauty through balance, proportion, and quiet dignity. Across the valley, countless smaller chaityas repeat these same principles on a reduced scale. Though constructed during later centuries, they preserve the essential characteristics of the larger stupas. Their restrained decoration, harmonious proportions, and symbolic imagery demonstrate the remarkable continuity of Nuar religious architecture over many generations. Towering above the western edge of Kathmandu stands perhaps Nepal's most famous sacred monument, Swayambhunath. Rising atop a forested hill reached by hundreds of stone steps, the great stupa dominates the valley below. Pilgrims ascending the staircase pass countless shrines, statues, and prayer monuments before reaching the summit, where one of the world's most celebrated Buddhist sanctuaries overlooks the surrounding landscape. The peaceful atmosphere of Swayambhunath forms an essential part of its spiritual power. Ancient trees shade rows of meditating Buddhas, while cool mountain breezes mingle with birdsong and the quiet murmur of prayers. Pilgrims slowly circle the monument, turning prayer wheels, fingering prayer beads, and softly chanting invocations to the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. The entire setting creates an overwhelming sense of serenity in which architecture, nature, and devotion become inseparable. Local legend adds another layer of meaning to this sacred place. According to tradition, the Kathmandu Valley was once a vast lake. The Bodhisattva Manjushri drained its waters by cutting a passage through the surrounding hills, revealing the fertile land beneath. At the center of the former lake blossomed a miraculous lotus, upon which the self-existent light of enlightenment appeared. Swayambhunath was built to commemorate this sacred event, making the monument not merely a temple but the symbolic birthplace of Nepalese civilization itself. Architecturally, Swayambhunath combines remarkable simplicity with extraordinary symbolic richness. The great white dome supports a square tower painted with the all-seeing eyes of the Buddha, watching compassionately over every direction. Above rises a gilded spire composed of successive rings representing stages of spiritual ascent toward enlightenment. Prayer wheels, gilded shrines, vajras, lions, symbolic animals, and countless images surround the central monument, creating a sacred complex where every detail carries religious significance. Another masterpiece of Buddhist architecture is the Great Stupa of Buddhanath, situated on the ancient trade route leading toward Tibet. For centuries, this monument welcomed merchants, monks, and pilgrims traveling between South Asia and the Tibetan plateau. Unlike the richly decorated surroundings of Swayambhunath, Buddhanath impresses through monumental scale and restrained elegance. The enormous white dome rises above concentric terraces surrounded by monasteries, prayer halls, and traditional homes, forming one of the greatest centers of Tibetan Buddhism outside Tibet itself. Buddhanath also illustrates Nepal's historic role as a bridge between civilizations. Pilgrims from Tibet, the Himalayan highlands, and the Kathmandu Valley have gathered there for centuries, transforming the monument into a meeting place of cultures. Although local tradition associates it with relics of the ancient Buddha Kashyapa, its greatest significance lies in its continuing role as a center of religious life, connecting the Buddhist worlds of India, Nepal, and Tibet. Beyond these famous monuments, the Kathmandu Valley contains hundreds of additional stupas and chaityas scattered throughout its towns and villages. Large and small alike, they reveal an astonishing consistency of artistic vision. Most originated as sacred reliquaries or gathering places for monks before gradually evolving into centers of community worship. As monastic life changed during the medieval period, many monasteries transformed into residential courtyards inhabited by lay families, while the central shrine continued serving as the spiritual heart of the neighborhood. Together, these monuments reveal the extraordinary achievement of Nuar civilization. Far more than impressive buildings, they embody centuries of religious devotion, artistic refinement, engineering skill, and cultural exchange. Rising beneath the snow-covered Himalayas, the stupas and temples of the Kathmandu Valley stand as enduring symbols of a civilization that united indigenous traditions with Buddhist philosophy, creating one of the world's most remarkable architectural landscapes. The Kathmandu Valley has often been described as a city of temples, but this expression is hardly an exaggeration. Travelers remarked that shrines seemed to outnumber ordinary houses, while sacred images appeared everywhere one looked. Temples filled city squares, lined narrow streets, crowned hilltops, and stood beside rivers, creating a landscape where religion and everyday life became inseparable. Although a few sanctuaries clearly reflected medieval North Indian architecture, the overwhelming majority displayed a style unlike anything found elsewhere on the subcontinent. Their design evolved into a distinctive architectural tradition that came to define Nepal itself. For many years, these buildings were simply grouped under the familiar label of the pagoda style. Yet the evidence increasingly suggests that this description is misleading. Temples of this form existed in Nepal before comparable structures appeared in neighboring countries. Rather than viewing Nepalese temples as local versions of a foreign architectural tradition, many historians now regard them as the original expression from which later East Asian forms ultimately developed. In this sense, the great multi-tiered temples of Kathmandu represent not an imitation, but an architectural innovation born in the Himalayas. The typical Nepalese temple followed a carefully balanced design. Rising from a square base of brick, each successive story narrowed gracefully toward the summit, creating an elegant vertical rhythm. Wide projecting roofs extended from every level, their corners sweeping gently outward while diminishing in size with increasing height. The uppermost roof was almost always covered with gilded copper, allowing sunlight to transform the entire structure into a brilliant beacon visible from great distances. Some temples stood upon massive stone terraces that elevated them above the surrounding city, reinforcing both their physical and symbolic importance. Perhaps the most striking feature of these temples lay not in their overall form, but in the astonishing richness of their carved woodwork. Every beam, window, doorway, pillar, cornice, and supporting strut became an opportunity for artistic expression. Sculptors covered these surfaces with images of gods, mythical creatures, flowering vines, geometric patterns, and scenes drawn from religious tradition. Supporting brackets beneath the roofs frequently took the form of beautifully carved deities, while windows were enclosed with intricate wooden latticework of extraordinary delicacy. Even elements that served purely structural purposes became masterpieces of decorative art. Some carvings also reflected ancient popular beliefs. Certain temples displayed explicit symbolic figures that modern visitors might find surprising. Rather than being intended simply as decoration, these images were believed to protect buildings from lightning, natural disasters, and malevolent supernatural forces. They reveal how practical architecture, religious symbolism, and folk tradition blended seamlessly within newer artistic culture. Inside these temples, the artistic richness continued. Rather than dividing the interior into numerous chambers, builders usually created a large central hall housing the principal shrine. Around the sanctuary hung ancient ceremonial objects, weapons, ritual vessels, and heirlooms accumulated over generations. Every surface reflected centuries of religious devotion, transforming the building itself into a living museum of Nuar history and craftsmanship. The mastery achieved by Nepalese woodcarvers remains one of the defining accomplishments of Himalayan civilization. Their ability to combine technical precision with graceful composition produced works of astonishing refinement. Whether depicting divine figures, elaborate floral patterns, or flowing ornamental designs, Nuar craftsmen demonstrated an extraordinary command of proportion, balance, and detail. Their creations rank among the finest surviving examples of architectural wood sculpture anywhere in Asia. Many of Nepal's most celebrated monuments embody this architectural tradition. Temples such as Taleju, Mahankal, Matsyendranath, Nyatapola, Dattatreya, Changunarayan, and Pashupatinath each display different interpretations of the same underlying principles while preserving a uniquely Nepalese identity. Among them, Nyatapola stands as one of the greatest achievements of Nuar engineering. Built upon 5 ascending platforms, the temple is approached by a monumental staircase guarded by pairs of increasingly powerful symbolic figures, warriors, elephants, lions, and divine beings, each representing a higher level of spiritual and physical strength. The famous Golden Gate of Bhaktapur and the magnificent entrance to Changunarayan demonstrate the same extraordinary attention to detail. Their carved surfaces, intricate metalwork, and harmonious proportions reveal a level of artistic refinement rarely equaled elsewhere in the Himalayan region. Although many surviving monuments date from the Malla period, their artistic foundations reach much deeper into Nepal's early history. Historical evidence strongly suggests that this architectural tradition spread outward from Nepal rather than arriving from China or Tibet. Chinese historical records themselves acknowledge that temples of this type were unknown in those regions before the 7th century AD. By contrast, Nepal already possessed mature examples at least a century earlier. Chinese envoys visiting Kathmandu during the 7th century praised the exceptional artistic skill of Nepalese craftsmen, providing valuable contemporary testimony to the valley's flourishing architectural culture. Although Buddhist stupas clearly derived from earlier Indian prototypes, the characteristic multi-tiered temple developed along a different path. Indian influence undoubtedly shaped many aspects of Nepalese art, yet the temple itself emerged as a distinct Nepalese creation. Its harmonious combination of brick construction, timber engineering, elegant proportions, and intricate decoration represents one of the country's most original contributions to world architecture. Equally remarkable was the spirit of religious coexistence embodied by these buildings. Buddhist and Shaivite temples frequently stood side by side, and some even housed deities belonging to different religious traditions within the same complex. This remarkable blending of faiths impressed the Chinese pilgrim Xuanzang, who observed an atmosphere of unusual harmony during his visit to Nepal. Architecture itself became a visible symbol of this cultural unity, expressing a society where different beliefs could coexist without losing their individual identities. The influence of temple architecture extended beyond sacred buildings. Ordinary homes and royal palaces adopted many of the same decorative principles, incorporating carved windows, elaborately ornamented balconies, wooden columns, spacious courtyards, and beautifully crafted waterspouts. Although residential buildings were generally smaller, they preserved the graceful appearance and quiet dignity of nearby temples. The royal palaces of Kathmandu, Patan, and Bhaktapur demonstrate how seamlessly religious aesthetics influenced civic and domestic architecture throughout the valley. Metal sculpture represented another field in which Nuar artists excelled. Craftsmen produced gilded copper images distinguished by calm expressions, elegant proportions, flowing garments, and extraordinary technical precision. Many statues were enriched with precious stones, coral, turquoise, pearls, and other luxurious materials. Images of Dipankara Buddha, Tara, Lakshmi, Saraswati, Krishna, and numerous other deities displayed an artistic sophistication that impressed visitors from across Asia. Contemporary observers even regarded Nepalese metal sculpture as surpassing the works produced in China and Japan during the medieval period. Stone sculpture evolved alongside these achievements. Early works closely reflected artistic developments in northern India while gradually acquiring a distinctive local character. Among the finest surviving examples are the Great Pillar at Changunarayan, elegant Vishnu images, monumental Garuda statues, the reclining Vishnu at Buddhanilkantha, and numerous sculptural groups decorating temples throughout the valley. These works combined simplicity, graceful composition, and expressive realism, creating a style that balanced spiritual symbolism with remarkable naturalism. Painting also flourished within Nuar civilization, although much of this artistic heritage has unfortunately disappeared. Wall paintings once decorated houses throughout the Kathmandu Valley, but only scattered examples survive today. More fortunate has been the preservation of richly illustrated manuscript covers portraying scenes from the Jataka tales, the lives of Buddhist saints, and important religious figures. These surviving works demonstrate remarkable skill in drawing, composition, and color, reflecting artistic traditions closely connected with the celebrated Pala and Western Indian schools while maintaining a distinctly Nepalese sense of movement and expression. Temple banners added yet another dimension to this visual culture. Painted on silk or canvas in brilliant shades of red, yellow, and green, these ceremonial banners displayed extraordinary mastery of color and symbolism. While the famous Thangka tradition ultimately arrived from Tibet, Nuar artists quickly adapted it to their own aesthetic preferences, contributing to the rich artistic exchange that linked Nepal with the wider Buddhist world. For centuries, the Kathmandu Valley stood at the crossroads of Asia, linking the civilizations of India, Tibet, and eventually China. Long before many neighboring kingdoms reached their artistic maturity, Nepal had already established itself as a center of architecture, sculpture, and religious learning. From this small Himalayan kingdom emerged traditions that would profoundly influence the Buddhist world, leaving an artistic legacy that stretched across the mountains into Tibet and beyond. Among Nepal's greatest cultural ambassadors was the celebrated Nuar master artist Araniko, one of the most remarkable figures in medieval Asian art. His career illustrates the extraordinary reputation Nepalese craftsmen enjoyed throughout the 13th century. According to historical accounts preserved in the Yuan dynasty chronicles, Araniko departed Nepal together with a group of sculptors, architects, and painters to undertake major religious projects commissioned by the rulers of Tibet. From there, his reputation spread to the imperial court of Kublai Khan, where his talents transformed the artistic relationship between Nepal and China. Even as a young man, Araniko displayed extraordinary ability. Contemporary records describe him as possessing an exceptional memory, capable of reciting Buddhist scriptures with ease while mastering the complex principles governing artistic proportion and design. He quickly surpassed his fellow craftsmen in architecture, sculpture, metal casting, and painting, demonstrating a versatility rarely found in a single individual. By his late 20s, he had already become recognized as one of Nepal's finest artists. His greatest opportunity arrived when Tibetan religious authorities requested a team of Nepalese craftsmen to construct a magnificent golden stupa. Although dozens of skilled artists were available, none wished to assume overall responsibility for such an ambitious project. Araniko, despite his youth, volunteered to lead the expedition. When doubts arose because of his age, he confidently replied that, although he might be young in years, his mind was not. The statement perfectly reflected the confidence and ambition that would soon make him famous across Asia. The completed monument astonished everyone who saw it. Finished within a remarkably short period, the stupa demonstrated such technical mastery that Tibetan religious leaders immediately recognized Araniko's exceptional talent. Impressed beyond expectation, they presented him to the court of Kublai Khan, where an even greater career awaited him. Chinese historical records preserve a vivid account of Araniko's first audience with the emperor. Curious about the young foreign craftsman, Kublai Khan asked whether he felt afraid upon arriving in China. Araniko responded with remarkable confidence, explaining that a true artist belonged to all lands and therefore had no reason to fear any country. His answer reflected not only personal courage, but also the cosmopolitan outlook shared by many medieval craftsmen who traveled widely in service of religion and empire. The emperor soon put his abilities to the test by assigning him the restoration of an important bronze imperial statue. Araniko completed the work with astonishing precision. Every detail, from the veins and folds of the figure to its overall proportions, appeared flawless. Chinese metalworkers, themselves heirs to one of the world's oldest artistic traditions, openly admired his achievement. His success immediately established him among the finest artists serving the Yuan Empire. Over the following years, Araniko directed the creation of countless religious sculptures, monumental works in bronze and iron, imperial portraits, and ceremonial objects. His paintings were considered unequaled, while his metal sculptures adorned monasteries and public buildings throughout the empire. Eventually, he received one of the highest artistic appointments available, becoming superintendent of imperial metal workshops and earning extraordinary favor at court. Even after his death, the emperor honored him with prestigious posthumous titles in recognition of his lasting contribution to Chinese civilization. Aranako's career demonstrates that Nepal's influence extended far beyond the Himalayas. Through artists like him, Nepalese architectural principles, sculptural techniques, and Buddhist artistic traditions reached Tibet, China, and eventually much of East and Southeast Asia. Although historical records remain incomplete, surviving evidence strongly suggests that Nepalese craftsmen helped shape monasteries, temples, paintings, and sculptures across a vast region stretching from the Tibetan Plateau to China, Burma, Siam, and perhaps even Sri Lanka. Yet despite this glorious artistic heritage, Nepal's creative traditions gradually entered a period of decline. The magnificent temple architecture, sophisticated wood carving, and refined artistic ideals that had once defined the Kathmandu Valley slowly gave way to imitation of foreign fashions and less ambitious forms of construction. Traditional carving became increasingly rare outside ancient temples, while newly built palaces adopted imported Western styles that often ignored the country's remarkable architectural inheritance. This decline did not occur suddenly, but developed over several centuries. Political fragmentation after the 16th century weakened the institutions that had long supported artistic achievement. Rival rulers became absorbed in internal struggles, placing personal ambition above cultural preservation. Royal patronage diminished, public investment in monumental architecture declined, and the unified vision that had once inspired Nepalese civilization gradually disappeared. Without strong political leadership, many artistic traditions that had flourished for generations slowly faded. The result was more than the disappearance of individual works of art. Nepal lost much of the cultural confidence that had once distinguished it throughout Asia. The ideals of religious harmony, artistic excellence, and national unity that had produced the masterpieces of the Kathmandu Valley weakened as political instability and aristocratic rivalry took their place. Although the great temples survived, the creative spirit that had built them became increasingly difficult to sustain. Understanding Nepal's earliest history presents historians with another equally difficult challenge. Reliable historical evidence becomes increasingly scarce before the 3rd century AD. For this early period, scholars depend largely upon inscriptions, foreign travelers' accounts, and a collection of traditional Nepalese chronicles known as the Vamsavalis. These chronicles preserve long lists of rulers, legendary events, and dynastic histories that remain indispensable despite their obvious limitations. Ancient Indian literature offers surprisingly little additional information. Although works such as the Arthashastra, the Natya Shastra, Buddhist Vinaya texts, and a handful of other writings occasionally mention Nepal, these references are generally brief and rarely provide enough detail to reconstruct the country's early political history. Nepalese religious texts such as the Swayambhu Purana and the Nepal Mahatmya contain vivid descriptions of the valley but are largely legendary in character, making it difficult to separate historical fact from sacred tradition. Even so, these scattered references remain extremely valuable. The Arthashastra mentions Nepalese woolen blankets traded in Pataliputra, confirming commercial connections with the Gangetic world. Later literary works identify Nepal as an established kingdom, while Buddhist traditions describe it as a difficult mountainous land inhabited by powerful tribes. Inscriptions from the Gupta period finally begin providing direct historical evidence, marking the point where Nepal gradually emerges from legend into documented history. The greatest challenge lies in evaluating the traditional chronicles themselves. Their long genealogies preserve names of rulers that might otherwise have been lost forever, yet they also contain obvious chronological problems. Many reigns are unrealistically long, dynasties appear to overlap, rulers are placed centuries away from their historically documented dates, and legendary figures are inserted alongside genuine historical kings. Rather than accepting every detail literally, modern historians compare these chronicles with inscriptions, archaeological discoveries, and foreign accounts to distinguish authentic history from later embellishment. A striking example of these chronological difficulties concerns the famous ruler Amsuvarman. Chinese sources clearly place his reign during the lifetime of the pilgrim Xuanzang in the 7th century. yet some traditional Nepalese chronicles incorrectly move him nearly 700 years earlier. Such discrepancies demonstrate that while the chronicles preserve invaluable historical memories, they must always be approached with careful critical analysis. Their greatest importance lies not in their precise chronology, but in preserving the framework upon which the early history of Nepal can gradually be reconstructed through comparison with more reliable historical evidence. The earliest history of Nepal presents historians with an unusual challenge. The country's traditional chronicles preserve long lists of rulers and dramatic accounts of ancient events, yet their chronology often conflicts sharply with inscriptions and archaeological evidence. One striking example is the reign of the famous ruler Amsuvarman. While inscriptions securely place him between the late 6th and early 7th centuries AD, some chronicles move his reign back to the 1st century BC. This is not an isolated mistake, but part of a broader pattern in which entire dynasties were shifted centuries earlier than modern evidence allows. Such distortions arose largely because medieval chroniclers attempted to create an unbroken royal genealogy extending back to the beginning of the current cosmic age. Faced with gaps in historical knowledge, they often lengthened reigns to 60 or 70 years, assigned impossible lifespans to kings, rearranged the order of rulers, and occasionally inserted entirely fictional dynasties. Some royal houses existed only in the imagination of later writers, while genuine historical dynasties were displaced by thousands of years. The result was an impressive but deeply unreliable chronological framework. Despite these problems, the chronicles remain indispensable. They preserve the names of many rulers who would otherwise be completely unknown, filling periods for which inscriptions and foreign accounts provide almost no information. Although historians cannot accept every date or event literally, these records continue to serve as the principal foundation for reconstructing Nepal's earliest past. Without them, the centuries before the 4th century AD would remain almost entirely obscure. Other ancient sources offer surprisingly little assistance. Most Puranas remain almost completely silent regarding Nepal, while the few literary references that survive are too brief and too vague to establish a reliable chronology. The chronicles therefore occupy a unique position. Their stories cannot always be verified, yet they preserve traditions that may contain genuine memories of early historical events hidden beneath layers of myth and legend. Modern historians must therefore approach them with both caution and respect, separating probable historical fact from later literary embellishment. According to these traditions, the story of Nepal begins long before the appearance of organized kingdoms. At the dawn of the mythical age known as the Satya Yuga, the Kathmandu Valley was said to have been covered by an enormous lake. Rising from its waters stood a miraculous lotus whose radiance attracted enlightened beings from distant lands. Buddhist tradition identifies this sacred lotus as the manifestation of divine presence upon the earth, drawing great Buddhas and Bodhisattvas to the valley. Yet, despite their visits, the waters remained undisturbed until the arrival of the Bodhisattva Manjushri. Legend tells that Manjushri cut a deep gorge through the surrounding hills at Chobhar, allowing the waters of the ancient lake to drain away. As the lake disappeared, fertile land emerged where the Kathmandu Valley now stands. Human settlement soon followed, and the chronicles describe the arrival of the first rulers, beginning with a king from Gauda whose descendants governed the newly habitable valley. These early traditions also suggest that Nepal quickly established contacts with India and even Sri Lanka, encouraging trade and cultural exchange long before the rise of historically documented dynasties. A parallel tradition preserved by Shaivite chroniclers presents a different version of the same story. In this account, the valley again became submerged after the destructive actions of a powerful demon. Lord Krishna eventually defeated the monster, the waters once more receded, and a new royal line known as the Matatirtha dynasty established control over the land. These rulers were later credited with giving the country its name, Nepal. Although clearly legendary, such narratives demonstrate how Buddhist and Hindu traditions both sought to explain the origins of the valley through sacred history. Interestingly, geological evidence provides unexpected support for part of these ancient legends. Scientific studies indicate that the Kathmandu Valley was indeed occupied by a vast prehistoric lake. Fossilized leaves and plant remains discovered beneath the modern surface suggest that dramatic environmental changes occurred over thousands of years. While these discoveries do not confirm the mythical stories themselves, they reveal that collective memory may have preserved echoes of genuine geological events long after their true causes had been forgotten. Following the legendary period, the chronicles introduce the first historically significant ruling people, the Kiratas. According to tradition, they entered the Kathmandu Valley from the east and gradually extended their authority across the region. Although later writers place their arrival as early as the beginning of the Kali Yuga, modern historical analysis suggests that the Kirata dynasty probably emerged around the 7th century BC. This dating fits much better with archaeological evidence and the broader history of the Himalayan region. Reconstructing the Kirata period remains extremely difficult because virtually no inscriptions, coins, or contemporary documents survive from these centuries. Historians therefore depend almost entirely upon the traditional chronicles despite their shortcomings. Every reconstruction of early Nepal before the 5th century AD must necessarily combine legend, archaeology, comparative history, and cautious interpretation. It is a period where certainty remains elusive and many conclusions remain provisional. Today, the Kirata peoples inhabit eastern Nepal between the Sun Koshi and Arun rivers. Many scholars believe they represent descendants of the same broad population that once ruled the Kathmandu Valley. Earlier discussions have suggested that the Nuars themselves may preserve important elements of this ancient Kirata heritage. Although some 19th century historians attempted to connect the Nuars with Tibetan populations, linguistic and historical evidence points instead toward a much older relationship between the Nuars and the indigenous Kirata communities of the eastern Himalayas. Ancient Indian literature sheds surprisingly little light on this formative period. The Brahmanas, Upanishads, major Puranas, and even the earliest Buddhist texts rarely mention Nepal by name. When the Mahabharata refers to a region called Kirata Desa, it provides almost no geographical detail, making identification difficult. Early Indian geographical lists also omit Nepal entirely, suggesting that the Himalayan kingdom remained beyond the principal horizon of many authors writing in the Gangetic Plains. Historical attention after the age of the Mahabharata shifted increasingly toward the kingdom of Videha. During its greatest expansion, ancient Nepal appears to have extended from the Gandak River in the west to the Sun Koshi in the east, reaching southward into the Terai. Whether Videha exercised authority over portions of the Himalayan foothills remains uncertain, but the geographical proximity of the two regions almost certainly encouraged regular interaction between them. The nearby state of Kapilavastu, famous as the homeland of the Buddha, occupied only a small territory near Nepal's southern frontier. Although part of modern Nepal now includes the site traditionally identified with ancient Kapilavastu, the Sakya kingdom belonged culturally and linguistically to the northern Indian world rather than to the Kirata traditions of the Kathmandu Valley. Its people spoke forms of Indo-Aryan speech, while the inhabitants of ancient Nepal retained languages and customs rooted in the Indo-Mongoloid cultures of the eastern Himalayas. Nevertheless, close cooperation between Nepal and neighboring Videha almost certainly existed from an early period. Trade routes, geographical proximity, and later political connections under the Licchavis all point towards centuries of interaction between the Himalayan Valley and the kingdoms of the Gangetic Plains. If the Nuars indeed preserve the heritage of the ancient Kiratas, then these relationships may have begun long before written history, forming the earliest foundations of Nepal's enduring connections with the civilizations to its south. The Kirata period marks the first chapter of Nepalese history that can be approached as something more than legend, although many uncertainties still remain. According to historical reconstruction based on the traditional chronicles, the Kiratas did not enter the Kathmandu Valley in a single migration. Instead, they appear to have arrived in several successive waves over the course of nearly 3 centuries before the beginning of recorded Nepalese history, with the final migration establishing itself around the 7th century BC. This gradual movement of people explains both the diversity found among the Kirata tribes and their lasting influence on the development of the valley. The royal genealogies preserved in the Vamsavalis list 29 Kirata rulers whose names display striking similarities to those still found among modern Kirata communities. Tribal names such as Kulung, Thulung, and Yelung closely resemble those recorded in the ancient chronicles. Even the traditional Newari name for Patan appears to preserve the memory of one of these early Kirata groups, suggesting that the first settlers left a lasting imprint not only on the population but also on the geography and identity of the Kathmandu Valley itself. Although the chronicles assign more than 11 centuries to the Kirata dynasty and place its beginnings deep in the 2nd millennium BC, modern historical analysis suggests a much shorter chronology. Calculating an average reign of approximately 25 years for each of the 29 rulers produces a far more realistic span of about 7 centuries. Combined with evidence surrounding the traditional visit of Emperor Ashoka, this calculation places the beginning of Kirata rule in the early 6th century BC rather than in the distant mythical past described by later chroniclers. The surviving chronicles preserve several different versions of the Kirata royal succession. While the spellings and order of names vary considerably, they consistently begin with Yalambara, the legendary founder of the dynasty, followed by a long sequence of rulers whose names echo those of later Kirata clans. Although historians cannot confirm every individual king, the repeated appearance of similar names across independent traditions suggests that these genealogies preserve genuine historical memories despite later embellishments. Some scholars have attempted to identify surviving sculptures and archaeological remains as products of the Kirata age. Whether these identifications prove correct or not, they reflect an important recognition that the Kiratas represented far more than a brief political dynasty. Their influence appears to have extended deeply into the cultural and artistic development of early Nepal, leaving traces that survived long after their rulers disappeared from the historical record. Kirata traditions themselves preserve memories of an even broader migration. According to later legends, related Kirata peoples once occupied an immense region stretching from the Brahmaputra Valley of Assam westward toward the Gandak River. This vast territory formed a continuous zone inhabited by Indo-Mongoloid communities who gradually displaced or absorbed earlier populations. Whether every detail of these traditions is historically accurate remains uncertain, yet they point toward the existence of extensive cultural connections across the eastern Himalayas long before the emergence of recorded states. One conclusion, however, appears difficult to dispute. The earliest history of Nepal is inseparable from the history of Indo-Mongoloid peoples. The Kiratas almost certainly reached the Kathmandu Valley by following the Bagmati River through the eastern Himalayan foothills. Their arrival was not a simple military expedition carried out by a handful of warriors, but a large-scale migration involving entire communities. Warriors, farmers, craftsmen, and families settled together, permanently transforming the social structure of the valley. Before their arrival, the valley was already inhabited by earlier populations of Ostroid and Dravidian ancestry. Very little is known about these original settlers, yet traces of their presence appear to survive within the Newari language and aspects of early Newar culture. The Kirata migrants did not completely replace these older inhabitants. Instead, the two populations gradually merged, creating a new society that combined different ethnic traditions into a single cultural community. This process of integration explains why the Newars later emerged as such a remarkably diverse people. If the identification of the Newars with the ancient Kiratas is broadly correct, then Kirata rule represented not the domination of outsiders over an indigenous population, but rather the political ascendancy of one branch of the valley's earliest inhabitants. At the same time, this interpretation should not be carried too far. The Newars ultimately became a composite people whose ancestry reflected successive waves of migration rather than a single ethnic origin. Equally important is the observation that Nepal did not lose its independent identity after the Kirata dynasty disappeared. Although later ruling families frequently traced their origins to northern India and claimed Kshatriya status, they rapidly became integrated into the society they governed. Local traditions remembered these rulers not as foreign conquerors, but as Nepalese kings who identified themselves with the land and its people. Political leadership changed, but the cultural continuity of the Kathmandu Valley remained largely unbroken. The next great chapter in Nepal's history belongs to the Licchavis. Curiously, most traditional chronicles fail to recognize them as a separate royal dynasty. Instead, they replace them with broad categories such as the solar and lunar dynasties, blending different royal families into a single continuous genealogy. Only one important chronicle, the Gopala Raja Vamsavali, explicitly states that the Licchavis entered Nepal after defeating the Kiratas. This omission illustrates once again the difficulties historians face when relying solely on medieval narrative traditions. Fortunately, inscriptions provide much firmer evidence for this period. Epigraphic records, together with reliable historical works such as the Manjushri Mulakalpa and the Sumati Tantra, establish beyond serious doubt that the early centuries of the Christian era through the end of the 8th century formed the Great Licchavi Age of Nepal. This conclusion directly contradicts the traditional chronicles, which almost entirely overlooked one of the country's most important ruling dynasties. Even the more reliable genealogies remain difficult to reconcile with the inscriptions. Different chronicles rearrange the order of rulers, divide a single dynasty into separate branches, or assign kings to incorrect generations. Names such as Kuvaravarman, Chandravarman, Bhaskaravarman, Jayavarman, and Bhumivarman appear in varying sequences depending upon the source consulted. As a result, historians must reconstruct the Licchavi succession by comparing inscriptions with these traditional lists rather than accepting any one genealogy at face value. Between the decline of Kirata authority and the secure establishment of the Licchavi dynasty lies one of the most obscure periods in Nepalese history. Because inscriptions are almost entirely absent, historians have long referred to these centuries as Nepal's Dark Age. Yet this darkness may be more apparent than real. If the traditional genealogies are interpreted carefully and the dating of early inscriptions is adjusted in light of modern evidence, much of the apparent historical gap begins to disappear. The chronicles provide enough names and events to suggest a continuous political tradition, even if many details remain uncertain. One possible explanation for the silence of the inscriptions is that Nepal temporarily lost part of its political independence during this transitional era. According to the chronicles, foreign invasions from the Indian subcontinent disrupted local rule, and archaeological evidence, including coinage resembling Kushan issues, points towards significant external influence. Rather than representing a complete break in Nepalese history, this period may reflect an age during which local rulers governed under varying degrees of foreign pressure while preserving the foundations of the civilization that would later flourish under the Licchavis. By comparing inscriptional evidence with the traditional genealogies, historians conclude that the Kirata dynasty had probably disappeared from the Kathmandu Valley by the middle of the 1st century AD. If the average reign of each ruler is calculated at roughly 20 years, and Emperor Ashoka's traditional visit is accepted as a chronological landmark, the Kirata line seems to have ended sometime around the 50s AD. Thereafter, Nepal entered a prolonged period in which its political independence appears to have weakened considerably. For nearly 3 centuries, from the middle of the 1st century until approximately AD 350, the valley may have remained under the influence of powerful kingdoms centered in the Gangetic Plains. Only a brief interruption seems to have occurred during the reign traditionally associated with Jayadeva I. This prolonged period of foreign dominance may explain why the inscriptions omit many rulers who nevertheless survived in the later chronicles. Rather than indicating that these kings never existed, the silence of the inscriptions may simply reflect changing political circumstances in which local authority operated beneath larger imperial powers. The Licchavis themselves may have reached Nepal during this unsettled age. As Kushan expansion transformed northern India, branches of the Licchavi family appear to have sought refuge in the relative security of the Kathmandu Valley. Their migration probably followed the collapse of earlier regional powers such as the Sungas, who were unable to withstand Kushan military pressure. Yet the Himalayas did not remain beyond imperial reach for long. Archaeological discoveries, especially Kushan coins found within the valley, strongly suggest that Nepal eventually came under Kushan political influence as well. The geographical position of Nepal helps explain this development. The Kushans maintained strong administrative centers across northern India while establishing authority over North Bihar, bringing their sphere of influence close to the Himalayan foothills. The Kathmandu Valley, connected to these regions through trade routes and mountain passes, naturally became part of the wider political landscape shaped by the Kushan Empire. After the decline of Kushan authority, other Indian dynasties emerged to dominate the Gangetic Plain. Among them were the Satavahanas, yet unlike the Kushans, they left almost no archaeological evidence in Nepal. No Satavahana coinage has been discovered in the valley, suggesting that their influence never extended significantly into the Himalayan kingdom. Likewise, the possibility of Yaudheya domination appears unlikely because of the considerable geographical distance separating their territories from Nepal. Additional clues emerge from the Sumati Tantra, a historical work that preserves traditions linking Nepal with the major dynasties of ancient India. Although the text primarily follows the political history of the Gangetic Plains, it implies that rulers in Pataliputra exercised varying degrees of authority over Nepal during certain periods. When combined with the evidence of Ashoka's traditional visit and the discovery of Kushan coins in the valley, these traditions strengthen the possibility that Nepal occasionally acknowledged powerful Indian monarchs while retaining its own local institutions. The fall of the Kushan Empire introduced another profound transformation, not primarily political, but cultural and religious. The Vakatakas, who emerged as one of the leading powers in India, helped stimulate a broad revival of Shaivism throughout the subcontinent. Nepal did not remain untouched by this movement. Although Buddhism had long flourished under the Kiratas, the Licchavis, and the Kushans, new religious influences gradually reshaped the spiritual life of the Kathmandu Valley. One of the most visible expressions of this revival centered upon the sacred sanctuary of Pashupatinath. According to later tradition, the site had once been associated with Buddhist worship before becoming one of the foremost centers of Shaivism. During the reign of Pasuparakadeva, the royal court appears to have embraced the worship of Shiva, marking an important turning point in Nepal's religious history. Although Buddhism remained deeply rooted among the general population, royal patronage increasingly favored the Shaivite tradition. The famous linga of Pashupatinath reflects this changing religious climate. Carved with 4 serene faces emerging subtly from a single stone, the sculpture closely resembles contemporary artistic traditions developing elsewhere in India during the early centuries of the Common Era. Its elegant craftsmanship, restrained symbolism, and refined execution make it one of the earliest surviving masterpieces of Nepalese religious sculpture. Although relatively few monuments from this early period survive, the Pashupatinath Linga occupies a uniquely important position. Because so many ancient buildings were destroyed or rebuilt over subsequent centuries, this sculpture serves as one of the rare surviving witnesses to Nepal's artistic and religious development during the transitional centuries between the Kirata and mature Licchavi periods. Even early Nepalese coinage reveals connections with the broader artistic traditions of the Gupta age, further confirming the valley's participation in the cultural currents of northern India. These artistic remains also assist historians in reconstructing the early Licchavi genealogy. If Pasuparakadeva is correctly placed within the period of Vakataka influence, then several rulers traditionally assigned to later generations must instead belong to the opening centuries of Licchavi rule. Such adjustments bring the traditional chronicles into much closer agreement with inscriptional evidence, allowing the scattered pieces of Nepal's early political history to fit together more coherently. Following the end of Kushan domination, India entered the age of the Gupta Renaissance, one of the greatest periods of religious, artistic, and intellectual revival in South Asian history. Shaivism became increasingly prominent at royal courts, replacing the strong Buddhist patronage that had characterized many earlier dynasties. Nepal, however, responded differently from its southern neighbors. Rather than abandoning Buddhism, the Kathmandu Valley gradually developed a remarkable synthesis in which Buddhist and Shaivite traditions merged into a distinctive religious culture unique to Nepal. This transformation occurred first within the royal court before spreading throughout society. Legends surrounding the philosopher Shankaracharya and King Shankaradeva symbolize this broader religious evolution. Although the historical details remain uncertain, they reflect a genuine process through which rulers who had once favored Buddhism increasingly embraced Shaivite worship without rejecting the older faith altogether. Instead of replacing one religion with another, Nepal developed a tradition in which both existed side by side. As this process continued, sectarian rivalries gradually diminished. Buddhist monks, Shaivite priests, and ordinary worshippers increasingly participated in shared religious practices, honoring both Buddhist and Hindu deities within the same sacred landscape. Earlier, tensions slowly gave way to a spirit of cooperation that became one of the defining characteristics of Nepalese civilization. The remarkable coexistence, still visible today in the temples and shrines of the Kathmandu Valley, has its roots in this formative period of religious synthesis. The inscriptions themselves provide striking evidence for this harmony. Kings devoted to Shiva made generous offerings to Buddhist institutions, while Buddhist monuments incorporated deities traditionally associated with Hindu worship. Even the Hinayana tradition continued to receive respect alongside Mahayana Buddhism and Shaivism well into the 7th century. Rather than dividing society, religion became a unifying force that blended diverse beliefs into a single cultural tradition. During this same era, Nepal produced one of the most celebrated rulers in its early history, Bhaskaravarman of the Licchavi dynasty. Later chronicles credit him with conquering the whole of northern India, a claim that is almost certainly exaggerated. Nevertheless, there is good reason to believe that his kingdom exercised authority over a remarkably large territory stretching across substantial parts of northern India, making the Licchavis one of the leading political powers of their age. The importance of the Licchavis is further reflected in Gupta coinage. Coins issued by Chandragupta I prominently display the name of the Licchavis, indicating the prestige of the dynasty and the close relationship between the Gupta rulers and their Licchavi relatives. Modern historians generally agree that both Chandragupta I and Samudragupta owed much of their political success to alliances forged with the Licchavi royal family through marriage and kinship. If the Licchavis who supported the Guptas were indeed the same dynasty ruling Nepal, the political significance of the Kathmandu Valley during the 4th century becomes much greater than previously imagined. Rather than existing as a remote Himalayan kingdom, Nepal may have stood at the center of an influential political network extending across northern India. In this interpretation, the territories associated with the ancient Licchavis, including regions around Vaisali, remained closely connected with Nepal throughout much of the Gupta period, making the valley an active participant in one of the most important eras of South Asian history. The close relationship between the Gupta Empire and the Licchavis may explain one of the most puzzling features of early Nepalese history. The famous Allahabad pillar inscription of Samudragupta identifies Nepal as one of the independent frontier kingdoms lying beyond the core territories of the Gupta Empire. These frontier states acknowledged Gupta supremacy through tribute and ceremonial attendance at the imperial court, yet they continued to govern themselves. The absence of any clear reference to the conquest of Vaisali has led some historians to suggest that the Licchavis retained authority over that important region during Samudragupta's reign, largely because of the close family ties linking the Gupta dynasty with the Licchavis. This situation appears to have changed during the reign of Chandragupta II. Later evidence suggests that Vaisali no longer enjoyed the same autonomous position and instead became incorporated into the Gupta administrative system through the province of North Bihar. Nepal itself likewise seems to have acknowledged Gupta overlordship sometime during this period, although the available inscriptions provide no direct account of military conquest. Rather than complete political subjugation, the relationship appears to have resembled one of diplomatic dependence combined with strong cultural influence. Indeed, Gupta influence proved far more significant in the cultural sphere than in politics. Nepalese sculpture, architecture, and artistic expression of the 4th and 5th centuries reveal unmistakable Gupta inspiration. The magnificent pillar and Garuda statue at Changunarayan stand among the finest surviving examples of this exchange. Their elegant proportions, refined carving, and symbolic imagery demonstrate how deeply Gupta artistic ideals penetrated the Kathmandu Valley, while simultaneously acquiring a distinct local character. The Gupta age also transformed Nepal's political institutions. Before this period, the Licchavis had inherited a republican tradition from their ancient homeland, preserving many features of collective government even after settling in Nepal. Authority rested not solely in the hands of a monarch, but within broader political institutions that reflected older republican customs. Under Gupta influence, however, this system gradually evolved into a hereditary monarchy centered upon the authority of a single king. Manadeva I became the first ruler to embody this new conception of kingship. Even then, the transformation occurred cautiously. Early royal inscriptions reveal that he adopted relatively modest titles, reflecting continued respect for the long-standing political traditions of his people. Only toward the end of his reign did grander royal epithets such as Maharaja begin to appear, signaling the gradual emergence of a stronger and more centralized monarchy. Under his successors, especially Vasantadeva, these more exalted titles became standard, reflecting the consolidation of royal authority. Yet Nepalese monarchy never developed into unrestricted despotism. Although Gupta political ideals strengthened the position of the king, the rulers of Nepal continued to recognize the importance of older local institutions. Village assemblies retained considerable influence over community affairs, and royal decrees frequently respected their traditional rights and jurisdiction. The king possessed supreme authority, but effective government still depended upon cooperation with local leaders who represented the interests of their communities. This balance between royal power and local participation became one of the defining characteristics of early Nepalese administration. Kings could establish courts, override local decisions, and demand compulsory labor for public purposes when necessary. Nevertheless, they generally avoided interfering unnecessarily in village affairs. The continued consultation of local assemblies reveals that older traditions of collective governance survived even as monarchy became the dominant political institution. Modern historians have sometimes attempted to explain later Nepalese government by tracing it directly back to the Licchavi constitution. One influential interpretation argued that the existence of two principal executive offices represented a continuation of the ancient Licchavi system. According to this view, the dual leadership of king and deputy reflected a constitutional arrangement inherited from the republican traditions of the Licchavis. Closer examination, however, suggests that such comparisons are misleading. The republican institutions of the Licchavis rested upon popular consent, with executive officials deriving their authority from election rather than hereditary right. The Raja and Uparaja exercised power because they represented the will of the people, who remained the ultimate source of sovereignty. This constitutional principle fundamentally distinguished the Licchavi system from later forms of shared kingship or regency. By contrast, later examples of dual authority in Nepal arose under very different circumstances. Whether during the age of powerful prime ministers or under systems of regency, authority no longer rested upon popular choice, but upon hereditary privilege or military power. The appearance of two leading figures within the government did not indicate the survival of republican traditions. Instead, it usually reflected practical arrangements in which real authority became concentrated in the hands of one dominant individual while another retained only ceremonial prestige. The political evolution of Nepal therefore cannot be reduced to a single continuous constitutional model. Each historical period produced institutions suited to its own circumstances. The republican traditions of the Licchavis, the later dictatorship established by Amsuvarman, the regencies of the Malla era, and the dominance of powerful hereditary prime ministers all emerged from different political conditions rather than representing successive stages of one unbroken constitutional development. What remained constant throughout these transformations was the remarkable adaptability of Nepalese political culture. Foreign influences, whether from the Guptas or other neighboring powers, were never adopted without modification. Instead, they blended with indigenous traditions, producing institutions uniquely suited to the Kathmandu Valley. Monarchy replaced republican government, yet village assemblies survived. Royal authority expanded, yet local customs endured. In the same way that Nepal had fused Buddhist and Shaivite traditions into a distinctive religious culture, It also transformed external political ideas into institutions that reflected its own historical experience and social character. One of the strongest objections raised against earlier interpretations of Nepalese history concerns the attempt to equate the government of the modern Rana era with the ancient Licchavi Republic. Such a comparison overlooks the fundamental political transformation that had taken place centuries earlier. Once the old tribal republics disappeared and Gupta political ideals spread into the Himalayas, Nepal gradually abandoned its republican traditions in favor of centralized monarchy. The liberal institutions that had once characterized the Licchavis steadily gave way to increasingly absolute forms of government. The political system dominated by the Rana family represented one of the clearest examples of this later development. Although authority appeared to be divided between two sovereign figures, the arrangement existed largely in form rather than in substance. The Maharajadiraja, or king, retained little more than ceremonial dignity, while the Maharaja, serving nominally as prime minister, exercised virtually all executive authority. He governed not merely as the head of government, but effectively as the real sovereign of the country, combining the powers of both monarch and minister in a hereditary office. The population therefore regarded him as the true ruler, regardless of the formal existence of the royal throne. Such a system bore almost no resemblance to the republican institutions of the Licchavis. In the ancient republic, political authority ultimately rested upon the consent of the community, and executive offices reflected a tradition of collective government inherited from earlier republican society. The dual leadership that existed under the Licchavis functioned within an entirely different constitutional framework from the later Rana arrangement, where hereditary privilege rather than public consent determined political authority. Similarities in appearance therefore conceal profound differences in political philosophy. Having examined the broader constitutional background, attention turns once again to the difficult problem of chronology. One of the most valuable inscriptions from ancient Nepal, issued during the reign of Manadeva, preserves a royal genealogy beginning with King Versadeva. A second inscription, commissioned by Jayadeva II, repeats the same succession while extending the genealogy by several additional generations. Since both inscriptions present Manadeva in exactly the same position within the royal lineage, historians have little reason to doubt that they refer to the same individual. Manadeva is clearly identified as the son and successor of Dharmadeva and as an ancestor of Jayadeva II, making his reign one of the principal chronological anchors for reconstructing early Nepalese history. Before these inscriptions can be fully understood, however, it is necessary to compare them with the genealogies preserved in the traditional chronicles. Those chronicles divide the rulers of this period into two principal dynasties. The first continues the line of the Suryavansis, or Solar dynasty, while the second introduces an entirely new royal house headed by the famous Amsuvarman and identified as the Thakuri dynasty. Because the reign of Amsuvarman can be dated securely through the observations of the Chinese pilgrim Xuanzang, it provides another reliable point from which earlier generations may be measured. The Suryavansi genealogy itself survives in several different versions. Among the earliest rulers appear names such as Chandravarman, Jayavarman, Brishvarman, Sarvavarman, Prithvivarman, Jeshthavarman, Harivarman, Siddhivarman, Basudatta, and Shripati. Later generations include Versadeva, Shankaradeva, Dharmadeva, Manadeva, and Vasantadeva before continuing through Udayadeva, Gunakamadeva, Sivadeva, Narendradeva, Bhimadeva, Vishnudeva, and Viswadeva. The sequence differs considerably between the surviving manuscripts, illustrating once again the difficulty of relying upon any single chronicle without comparison to inscriptions and archaeological evidence. The confusion becomes even greater because some chronicles insert Amsuvarman immediately after these rulers, while others begin an entirely separate Thakuri dynasty with his accession. In addition, several important kings appear more than once under slightly different names, while others disappear altogether. Such inconsistencies suggest that later chroniclers combined originally independent royal traditions into one continuous genealogy without fully understanding the historical relationships between them. One particularly difficult problem concerns the repeated appearance of rulers named Manadeva and Sivadeva. Historians must determine whether these names refer to the same individuals or to different kings separated by generations. Earlier, scholarship identified Siva Bridivarman from one genealogical list with Sivadeva I, a ruler whose reign can be dated with confidence because of Xuanzang's testimony. At the same time, evidence suggested that more than one king named Manadeva ruled Nepal, creating additional uncertainty in reconstructing the royal succession. An important breakthrough came from a manuscript of the Sumati Tantra preserved by the Rajguru of Nepal. Unlike the version known in the British Museum, this manuscript assigns a specific regnal year to one Manadeva, placing him in Shaka, year 498, corresponding to AD 576. An annotation further relates this date to the Nepal era, providing independent confirmation of the chronology. This discovery greatly clarified one branch of the royal genealogy by establishing the reign of one Manadeva with considerable precision. Even so, difficulties remain. Another Manadeva appears in connection with inscriptions issued during the reign of Jisnugupta, raising the question of whether the two names belong to separate rulers or whether one of the readings has been misunderstood. Later research has suggested that at least one traditional reading may have been incorrect, reducing some of the apparent confusion. Nevertheless, establishing the exact sequence of these rulers continues to depend upon careful comparison of inscriptions, manuscripts, and the sometimes contradictory evidence preserved in the chronicles. The traditional genealogies also omit several historically documented rulers altogether. Mahideva, whose existence is firmly established through inscriptions, is absent from the chronicles, while Ganadeva, whose reign unquestionably followed Vasantadeva according to epigraphic evidence, likewise fails to appear in the expected position. These omissions demonstrate that the chroniclers were concerned less with preserving an accurate historical record than with constructing a continuous royal narrative. Their lists therefore remain valuable, but only after being corrected and reorganized in the light of more reliable archaeological and inscriptional evidence.